Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Tom Hiddleston, Jeremy Irons and Luke Evans move into the HighRise, an adaptation of J.G. Ballard's 1975 novel. Dr. Robert Lang, played by Tom Hiddleston, has just got himself a comfortable apartment within the brand new HighRise designed by architect Anthony Royal, played by Jeremy Irons, who lives up on the top floor. Contained in its 40 floors, the state-of-the-art building has everything you could want: a fully stocked supermarket, a gym, a swimming pool, and isolation from the outside world. But inside the tower, conflicts and divisions between the richer and poorer residents begin to emerge, and as the power in the building begins to fail, its hallways descend into violent anarchy and chaos. HighRise is a passion project for producer Jeremy Thomas, who picked up the rights in the mid-70s, around when the book was first published, with the intent of doing a film adaptation for director Nicholas Roeg. Unfortunately, that didn't really work out, and he's spent ever since then trying to get off the ground. So HighRise is actually a film 40 years in the making. At one point it was actually considered to be unfilmable, just flat out. And if you're not familiar with J.G. Ballard's work, then maybe you can understand why it was so difficult, because Jeremy Thomas has actually shepherded another Ballard adaptation in the past. 20 years ago, in fact, he was the one that produced the David Cronenberg movie Crash. Not the Oscar winner Crash, I mean the one where people are sexually turned on by car crashes. Yeah, that one, that little controversy magnet. So you can understand why HighRise is such a difficult book to bring to the screen when you realise some of the author's other work. Eventually it comes to us in the form of director Ben Wheatley, along with his wife Amy Jump, who wrote the script, and they both edited it together. Ben Wheatley is actually a perfect fit for this project, because if you've seen his other movies like Down Terrace or Kill List or Sightseers, you know that he has a very British, very darkly comic sensibility, that sort of feeling that other people are the bane of existence, which very much fits in sort of the plot and premise of HighRise. It will be interesting to see how this translates to international audiences, because Ballard's book is very much rooted in the mid-70s British social issues. The flats, for example, the sort of high-rises that were being built at the time as a way of giving housing after the war, and quite prophetically, those did turn out to be magnets for crime and so forth. And also what you've got in the movie is the power blackouts that plagued Britain during the 70s, because there wasn't enough to cope with demand, and that sort of integrated into the plot as well. And I'm not sure how well international audiences will be familiar with those points of reference, and it becomes a very literal power struggle in this particular case. Now, what Wheatley does that really works is that he doesn't try to update the setting, he doesn't try to bring it into the modern day as such, keeps it very specifically in the 70s. Again, it's very much part of the material, you can't really separate the book from the period it was set, and I think Wheatley has done an excellent job in figuring that out. And to that end, the movie has this fantastic look about it. The production design is absolutely first rate, it is superb. The design of the HighRise and the interiors is very modernist but brutalist. It has this very retro-futuristic look. It really fits this sort of period that we're in right now, where we're drawing a lot of retro sort of feeling from previous decades and sort of modernising them and updating them. I think HighRise perfectly captures that period and look, and there's a lot of attention to detail. It very much feels like the 70s, even down to the items that are in the supermarket. It really gives a sense of an internal world to this movie inside the HighRise, and that's something that you want, because on one level, Ballard's allegory is meant to be sort of society in general. So you have the poorest people on the lower floors, typically families, for example, and then you've got the middle class people like Tom Hiddleston's Lang in the middle floors, and then at the very top you have your 1%ers, people like Royal, for example. All these parts of the flats are meant to be a body, so the top would be the head and the bottom is the feet. And it's a very complex sort of metaphor. There's a lot going on in this movie. HighRise opens fantastically. The opening sequence perfectly sets up the very dark and comic tone of the movie, but also this sense of mean-spiritedness and the core themes of the movie. And I thought we were really onto something special. I was very much looking forward to seeing how this all panned out. And I think past that is due to the performances as well. The performances in this movie are fantastic, and many of the cast do superb jobs. Tom Hiddleston as Lang, for example, is quietly superb. He's this middle-class guy who we see much of this movie through, and at first he doesn't seem to have much of an identity, but later on we can kind of see that he has a capacity for violence and his adaptability to his environment that makes him very interesting and almost threatening in a way. He's perhaps one of the most dangerous people in there. But it's not a role where Hiddleston has to show off. It's a role that very much puts him almost to the sidelines. He's more of an observer than a direct participant in the plot. The plot goes on around the character rather than with him. And that may put some people off, because even though he's the protagonist, he's not really active in it. Who is rather active is Jeremy Irons as the architect, and again, he's brilliant in the movie. You get the sense that he's trying to do something good, but he's too self-absorbed. He doesn't know how to connect with people. He designed the building in a well-intentioned way. He wanted it to do good, but of course he's oblivious to how just what he's created, the sort of monster that he's unleashed. Essentially, he's very much disconnected and sort of almost kind of naive in a sense about just how destructive this building is. But by far the best cast member is Luke Evans, and I know I've said in the past that I've not liked some of his performances, but here this is a truly fantastic performance. He's really off the leash as Wilder, very appropriately named in fact. It's a role that is very much the powder keg at the centre of this movie. He really drives, in some senses, the destruction and sort of the class warfare that goes on within this movie. He stole the movie for me. He's probably the most memorable element in it. He's almost like a rabid dog towards the end of the movie. He's really quite terrifying in some scenes towards the last act of the film. And there's these really interesting themes at work here, like the fact that this is an attempt to try and homogenise society, getting the rich and the very poor within the same building and trying to interact with each other for their mutual benefit, but it's not really working. They're just opposing each other and trying to claim things for themselves, and it's very much about social sort of strata. And then you've got this other thing as well about how you're feeling almost compartmentalised within this building. This is why the production design is so important, in that the buildings have to feel in some way anonymous and cold, and especially in Lang's apartment, which he leaves largely generic, and it's meant to feel very enclosed and impersonal, but there's also that sense in the way that everything is within the same building. The gym, the shopping mall, the supermarket, everything is within the same building, and while it also builds that sort of society metaphor that I said earlier, it also is meant to distance them from the outside world. It's meant to feel very self-contained and almost imprisoning. Where the movie lost me was roughly around the halfway point. In fact, I can almost pinpoint the moment for you. There's a key montage in the middle of the film, and by itself it's a fantastic montage. It's this real kaleidoscopic, fragmented montage that's meant to show the declining psyche of Lang's mind, and it's a pivotal moment in the film, and it's fantastically realised. But before that particular montage, things hadn't really declined that much. They were beginning to fall apart. But afterwards, it's all gone to hell. Suddenly, people are fighting in the corridors, all the power is out, it's everyone for themselves. And that is the entire second half of the film, and it felt like we jumped a massive amount in that period of time, and this movie is meant to play out over about 3 months, and it feels like we've skipped the second month. There's no vicarious thrill, because we don't see the society that's been built within this high-rise fall apart. It yanks you out of the movie, and I end up watching the second half in almost a kind of detached fashion. And I understand that some of this was intentional. Wheatley has this very ordered feeling to the first half of the movie, with these hints of anarchy flaked in increasingly. But then it suddenly goes into chaos, but it doesn't feel like there's a structure to it. It just feels like a lot of bits and a lot of individual scenes that don't really connect very well with each other. And we don't understand what's happening in relation to one thing. We don't understand why characters are doing these things. What I suspect has happened, Wheatley and Jump have tried to condense down a lot of the characters, and you can understand why some people in the past have called this unfilmable. You can't really get a through line because, of course, Hiddleston's character, he's essentially in his own private world, in his own room, and you have this interesting thing with this character in that he loses his identity gradually, and again he becomes commoditized for his body and sex, and that becomes a crucial thing in the movie, this whole sexual element. I think one of the oddest things about the film and why it doesn't entirely succeed is that the book is meant to be an allegory, as I keep mentioning, but when you try and portray that on film, where it's semi-realistic, despite the surrealistic elements in the story, is that you end up in this weird kind of space, and the audience starts asking questions like, okay, if the building is such a hellhole and things are rapidly falling apart, why don't people just leave? Why don't people move? Why don't the police get involved? Why are the police not investigating the guy that leapt to his death from outside the building? And the movie kind of builds a vague conspiracy element that fuels Wilder, but it doesn't really follow that train of thought. It doesn't want you to follow that train of thought. And I think to some extent, Wheatley ends up drawing the audience's attention to it too much. I think part of the problem is that it is clearly established that these people inside the building, that they have jobs and they have places that they go to. There's a car park and there's people that drive in and out of the car park. That the entire movie isn't set within this high-rise. We even get scenes of Hiddleston at his job outside of the high-rise. So there's clearly a world around it, and I think what Wheatley maybe should have done is get rid of those scenes, because it doesn't really work if we're trying to build this analogy for society and how, you know, our social graces are essentially a thin veneer to try and hide our sort of animalistic tribal instincts, our very much survival of the fittest. It's meant to have this Lord of the Flies kind of analogy. And I don't want to sound like I'm really negative on this film, because for all the things that I had issues with on a visual level and in terms of its ambition, it is amazingly made. I want to say that it will be very divisive. I think there will be people that really hate this movie, and I think there will be people that will really love it and champion it, and I think it's going to have a really good future as a cult film because of that. I think, how I personally feel, I think it's a really good try, but this is a tough nut to crack, and I don't think they've quite done it, but there's a lot of virtues in it still. HighRise is a polarising film of which I've seemed to have fallen right down the middle. It starts out fantastically and promises a wonderfully dark and humorous take on difficult source material. This is a film that looks and sounds absolutely superb, with terrific performances from Hiddleston, Irons, and especially a scene-stealing Luke Evans. Wheatley is a good fit for the material and its twisted touches, but it doesn't quite live up to that early potential, lapsing around halfway through into confusion and disjointedness, and it doesn't feel like Wheatley is entirely in control. It becomes more of a collection of bits, some successful individually, others not so much, but it doesn't work cohesively. It's well worth paying a visit, and I want to love the film for its ambition, but it will likely stand as an interesting cult item. In the coming episodes, Jeremy Irons pops up again, mentoring Dev Patel in the biopic The Man Who Knew Infinity, while we see what Chris Hemsworth's Huntsman got to before meeting Snow White in The Winter's War. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.